Good afternoon, GCSE history students. It's Miss Talentire, and today I'm going to do a quick tutorial on how to answer section A from your medicine paper, which is the British sector of the Western Front, 1914 to 1918, injuries, treatment and trenches. So in your medicine paper there are two sections, section A and section B. So we're going to be just looking at section A today, and there's three questions that you will see. So question 1 is really simple and it's worth 4 marks. Describe two features of ill health among soldiers that arose from the trench environment. So this question will always be to describe two features of something to do with the conditions in the trenches or hospitals or medical care to do with the 1914 to 1918 front line. So in this particular question, it's asking you about the trench environment. So we're thinking about things like lice, rats, and any other environmental factors that you'd find in the trench. So if you want to give this question a go, give yourself about 4 or 5 minutes to think of two features that you would find in the trench and tell me a little bit about them. Tell me about how it would affect a soldier living in the trenches and fighting in the trenches, and it's worth 4 marks, so you need to give two features and 2 explanations. So if you'd like to give it a go, you can pause the video now. Okay, here are some model answers that you could use. So you could have said that one feature was that there was a problem with rats, and then the explanation is that rats often spread infection and disease. You could have said that many men became infested with lice and developed something called trench fever, and the explanation is it was difficult to keep clothes clean. And the final feature you could have chosen was the soldiers often developed trench foot, and they had to stand in wet and muddy trenches, which would have caused it. So you could pick 2 of those for your answer. You only need 2 features, not 3, but obviously I've given you an extra one there for your revision. So question 1's really simple. All you have to do is describe 2 features of a particular element of the Western Front. Question 2. Now you might assume that this question is actually quite familiar, and it is. This question also comes up in the Weimar Nazi Germany paper, but instead of being source A and B, it just happens to be source B and C. So in this particular paper, you get 2 sources, and just like in your Nazi Germany paper, all you have to do is write 2 separate paragraphs on the sources. What you're not going to do is compare how useful they are to each other. So you're not telling me that you think source A is better than source B or vice versa, and you're not going to do a big conclusion at the end telling me which source you think is the best. Okay, so you're not comparing them, you're looking at them completely separately. So let's read the question. How useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the work of the stretcher bearers on the Western Front? So looking at these 2 sources, we're going to look at them completely separately, and we're going to do a little answer for each one. So for source A, as you can see, it's a written source, so we'll give that a read in a moment, and source B is a picture source with a description. So as we're looking at them separately, let's start with source A and give it a read. So source A. Source A is a letter written by a captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps, or the RAMC, to his family in 1915. He was in charge of a group of stretcher bearers, and here he is describing the work of his group of stretcher bearers after a German attack on the British trenches. So as I read through, you might like to make some notes about any of the different examples that you can see about stretcher bearers' work or the conditions that they worked in, and you might like to bullet point them. Or alternatively, if you wanted to print out this slide, you could print out the source and highlight it. Okay. At 2 a.m, a terrifying bombardment began, and at 5 a.m, the first batch of wounded began coming down the communication trench. It was evening by the time I got out of the trench to look for more wounded. I went off with another man to search for the wounded. We found most of them in a wooded area, so weak that they could not call out. They were so relieved at being found that I led a search for more wounded. It was awful work getting them out of the shell holes. It was also hard to find enough men to carry them away, because the stretcher bearers were so exhausted. Finally, we got our last wounded to safety at 4 a.m. the next morning. Altogether, we'd collected 18 men in a single day, and were certain that no one was left behind. So, fantastic source there. Love this source. We need to do 4 things now. Firstly, we need to say why it's useful because of its content. So what can I actually read in that source? What can I pick out? What quotes can I take? Then we're going to look at the context. What do I know from my own knowledge that makes this source useful or accurate or inaccurate? Then we look at the provenance. So where does it come from? Why was it made? Who made it? When was it made? So the nature, the origin and the purpose. And then we do a little judgment for source A. How useful do we think source A is? Is it useful for learning about stretcher bearers on the Western Front? Is it partially useful? Is it somewhat useful? Or is it not useful? Now, I've never quite come across a question where the source would be absolutely not useful at all, but there may be sources that are more useful than others. So, for this particular question, I've written some model answers. If you want to give this question a go first, that's absolutely fine. You can just pause the video now. Or if you'd like to see my model answer for source A, just to give you a little bit of a look at what source B might look like, then equally, you might like to do that first. So pause the video now if you want to do this on your own, or keep listening if you want to see the model answer. Okay, so for the content, this is what I have written. As you can see, it's not really short, but it's not anything ridiculously long. It's 2 sentences and a quote. So I've said, source A is useful for learning about the work of a stretcher bearer on the Western Front because it shows how important they were to the morale of injured soldiers stuck out on no man's land. Source A is also useful because it shows how stretcher bearers were expected to search for the wounded. For example, source A says, they were so relieved at being found that I led a search for more wounded. So as you can see, all I've done is I've read through the source, I've summarised why I think it's useful about the role of a stretcher bearer. So I've said that it's really good for those who were wounded. It really boosts the morale of those people when they know that somebody is looking for them, somebody's coming to save them. And I've also said that it shows how important they are because they were expected to search for the wounded. So they wouldn't just, call out, does anyone need help? They'd physically go and search on no man's land until they found as many men as possible. So that's all you'd need to write for the content. You give me a bit of a rough summary of the source, why it makes it useful or partially useful or really useful, and a little quote to back up what you're saying. For context, this is where you tell me, with your own knowledge, is the source accurate? Is it inaccurate? Is it biased? Is it useful? Is it not useful? So let's have a little look at what I've put. Source A is useful because I know from my own knowledge that the work they completed was gruelling and they came into difficulty with the terrain of the trenches. Therefore, they needed to work in groups of 4 so that they could carry wounded men between them. So I've picked up a little bit on the source how it says that there was quite a team of men working together, and I know from my own knowledge that men would work in groups of 4 so that they could have 2 people, one at the front of the stretcher and one at the back, or they could have 2 people at the front of the stretcher and 2 people at the back and keep swapping so that the stretcher bearers didn't become too exhausted. So I've picked up a little bit about how we worked in a team, and then I've given my own knowledge to back it up and said that that actually makes the source useful because I know that it's accurate. Okay, now you're going to look at the provenance. So who wrote the source? When was the source made? What was the purpose of the source? And does that affect its utility? Does that affect how useful the source is? So I've said, the nature and the origin of the source make it useful because it is a letter written by a captain in the RAMC. As someone who was directing and participating in the work of stretcher bearers, his knowledge should be accurate. However, as it is a personal letter to his family, it could be expected that this would be an honest account, but that some details might have been missed out because of censorship or because he did not want his family to be upset. Therefore, the purpose of the source makes it lose some of its utility. So I've said, I do think it's really useful because it was written by someone who obviously experienced it and his knowledge would be accurate. However, if he's writing a letter to his family, he might not want to put an example of seeing a corpse with the legs missing or seeing men who he hadn't got to in time who were dead. He's probably going to avoid giving some gory details because he doesn't want to upset or scare his family or make his family worried that he himself could be in danger. So it might be accurate, but maybe not 100% of the picture. Finally, for my overall judgment, I'm keeping it nice and brief, and I'm going to sum up overall to what extent I think that this source is useful. Overall, source A is very useful to a historian studying the work of stretcher bearers on the Western Front. Now, you might like to go into a little bit more detail in your overall judgment, but just for the sake of this model answer, I haven't gone into too much detail. I've just kept it quite brief. Okay, so now that you've seen how I've attempted this question, I want you to give this a go, but I want you to do it for source B. So in the exam, you'd have to do an answer for source A and then a separate answer for source B. As I say, you're not comparing the sources, you're looking at them separately. So I want you to spend roughly 10 minutes giving this question a go for me, just how I've done before, but using source B instead of source A. So pause this video now and give this a question a go. Okay, hopefully you gave that a go, and if you'd like me to mark your answers, please just send them to me and I'll do my best to give them a mark. Final question, question 3. It's technically question 2B, but you know, it's the third question you'll see. How could you follow up source A to find out more about the work of stretcher bearers? Now this question is particularly tricky because it's asking you to do specific things, and every year it trips up students who don't quite get it right. So this particular question you must answer in a particular way. So for example, the detail that you want to follow up, well, that needs to be a direct quote. So let's do it together. What do I want to pick out of this source to find out more about the stretcher bearers? Now, you're not actually going to be doing this research or to be finding out more, but this is almost like a plan. What would you do as a historian if you wanted to find out more from source A? So let's pick out a quote. I've chosen this one. We had collected 18 men in a single day. I'm quite interested in that because that's quite a high number of people to physically collect off no man's land and get away with it successfully, but I want to find out a bit more about the work of the stretcher bearers. So this is my question that I would ask. What was the average number of men rescued? So is 18 the average? Is it lower or is it higher? So I'd want to find out a bit more. For example, is 18 a record or is it below average? What type of sources could I use to answer this question if I want to find out more about how many men they would collect? Well, I might like to use the RAMC records. So remember, the Royal Army Medical Corps, the RAMC, they're going to keep extensive written records of the people that they are employing, of the people that they are collecting from the trenches, of the people that they are treating. So I'm going to use those records to look at a group of stretcher bearers and see how many patients did they collect, how many victims did they collect in their work. Finally, how is this actually going to help me answer my question? Well, the records would show how many wounded soldiers the stretcher bearers brought to the CCS. I think that answer is relatively straightforward, and I think the first part of the answer is definitely straightforward. It shouldn't be too difficult to pick a quote, because all you have to do is read through the source and pick something that you think is interesting. So if I want to find out more about the stretcher bearers, let's pick out a quote. Then you just come up with a question that you would ask based on that quote. You tell me what type of source you would use and how it would actually help you answer your question. Now, it isn't enough to just say that I would use a written source or a picture source or a diary entry. You have to be a bit more specific about which type of written source or picture source or diary entry that you would use. For example, the Royal Army Medical Corps records. So those are the 3 questions that you get asked in your Section A medicine paper. Hopefully you found this useful, and hopefully this will give you a little bit of advice going forward. And maybe you would like to give this question a go. This is a follow-up question. If you feel confident enough, why don't you give a go to this question? So instead of doing question 3 with source A like I've done, maybe you could do it with source B. Okay. Hope you enjoyed this video, or hope it was useful, and if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask. Thanks very much. Bye.